Sometimes all it takes is a few nights without proper sleep for the brain to start behaving strangely. At first, it feels like normal exhaustion. Thoughts become fuzzy, focus slips. But then something more unsettling happens. You begin to feel as if someone is nearby, not a shape, not a figure, just a presence. And then come the sounds, words, fragments of sentences, sometimes full phrases. It's important to say this right away. This isn't mysticism, and it doesn't mean you're losing your mind. This is a well-documented state that can happen to perfectly healthy people at the boundary between sleep and wakefulness, when the brain is so tired that it stops clearly separating internal processes from external reality. And this is where the first uncomfortable question appears. If the brain can generate experiences this convincing entirely on its own, then where exactly is the line between what's real and what's simply happening inside us? We're used to thinking that if another form of life exists, it must be somewhere far away, in deep space, beneath the ice of distant planets. We listen to the silence of the universe, hoping to catch even the faintest signal. But what if we're looking in the wrong direction? What if something radically alien to familiar biology isn't out there, but right here, inside the human mind? To understand this, we need to step back and talk about one idea. An idea so simple that it's often underestimated, and so powerful that it changes how you see everything. When people talk about the greatest ideas in history, they usually mention gravity, relativity, quantum mechanics, but there is one concept that doesn't explain how planets move or particles behave. It explains why complexity exists at all, why order emerges from chaos. That idea is natural selection. Not as a chapter from a biology textbook, but as a fundamental algorithm of reality itself. In its simplest form, it sounds almost trivial. If something can make copies of itself, those copies will never be perfectly identical. Most variations will fail and disappear, but a few will work slightly better, and those will spread. No plan, no intention, just cold, relentless math. Anything that can copy itself in this way is called a replicator, and once a replicator appears, the process becomes unavoidable. This is how life began on Earth billions of years ago, not with animals, not with plants, not even with cells. It started with a tiny self-copying structure, so simple you wouldn't see it even with the most powerful microscope. And yet that one structure triggered a chain reaction whose results are now visible from space. All the green covering this planet is the outcome of copying, errors, and selection. Here's the key point. This mechanism isn't biological in the narrow sense. It doesn't care what the replicator is made of. It can be a molecule, a chemical chain, anything at all, as long as it can copy itself. Wherever conditions allow self-copying to exist, this algorithm turns on as inevitably as gravity turns on when there is mass. And now we can ask a question that becomes deeply unsettling. If this mechanism is so universal, why does the human species look like a glitch in the system? We evolved from the same primate lineage as other species. Our closest relatives are chimpanzees. Our DNA is almost identical, and yet the gap between us is enormous. In just a few million years, one branch stayed in the forest, the other built cities, financial markets, the internet, movies, philosophies, and theories about its own existence. We discuss abstractions, we create symbols, we experience a persistent inner self. It feels as if evolution suddenly hit the accelerator. The first explanation that comes to mind is genes. Maybe humans simply have better or special genes. But here's the problem. Human DNA doesn't look extraordinarily complex. In size and structure, it's not fundamentally different from that of many other animals. In fact, some species have more DNA than we do. There's no hidden line of code that explains civilization. So maybe the answer is the brain? Yes, but that only makes things stranger. The human brain is an evolutionary anomaly. It's too large, not just slightly oversized, radically so. Relative to body size, it's several times larger than what basic biological logic would predict. But size alone isn't the real issue. The real problem is cost. The brain is incredibly expensive to run. It consumes about 20% of the body's total energy constantly, even when you're doing nothing, even when you're asleep. In children, that number can be even higher, sometimes approaching half of the body's energy budget. From the perspective of natural selection, this is insane. Evolution hates inefficiency. It doesn't invest just in case. If an organ costs this much, it must provide an immediate and critical advantage for survival and reproduction. And yet, here's the paradox. All the standard explanations, hunting, navigation, social coordination, don't require anything close to this level of neural power. Many animals hunt, navigate, and cooperate brilliantly with far smaller brains. Building a human brain for those tasks is like constructing a nuclear reactor just to boil water. And yet, evolution stubbornly went in this direction. It didn't just keep the large brain, it kept making it larger, generation after generation, for millions of years. Which means there must have been an incredibly strong selection pressure, strong enough to outweigh enormous energy costs, and most importantly, not all parts of the brain expanded equally. Regions responsible for breathing, basic emotions, and reflexes stayed relatively unchanged. The explosive growth happened elsewhere. In the areas associated with planning, abstraction, self-control, and internal goals, the parts of the brain that make us feel like a unified self. And here we reach the point where standard explanations begin to crack. Because if this structure wasn't optimized primarily for keeping the body alive, then what exactly was evolution selecting for? If we look closer at what exactly expanded inside the human brain, the picture becomes even stranger. The regions responsible for breathing, basic emotions, and raw survival stayed almost the same. What grew disproportionately was something else entirely. The areas involved in planning, impulse control, abstraction, and long-term goals. The parts that give us a sense of continuity, the feeling that there is a single, coherent me behind our thoughts and actions. This region is so unusual that neuroscience still struggles to define its core function precisely. Descriptions tend to sound vague, organizing thoughts and behavior according to internal goals. If you stop and think about it, that explanation barely explains anything. What makes this even more unsettling is what happens when this part of the brain is damaged. A person can survive. They can walk, talk, recognize faces, and perform basic tasks. From the outside, they may appear almost normal, but something fundamental changes. Their personality shifts, their ability to plan collapses, impulse control weakens, the sense of responsibility and inner direction fades. The body survives, but the person is no longer quite the same person. Now compare that to other animals. Take speed away from a cheetah and it dies. Take vision away from an eagle and it cannot survive. Disrupt echolocation in a bat and it quickly perishes. But a human can lose a significant portion of what seems to be the brain's main upgrade and remain biologically alive. That alone should make us pause. It suggests something unsettling. this part of the brain may not have evolved primarily to keep the body alive. So what was it selected for? To get closer to an answer, we need to stop thinking about intelligence and start looking at behavior. One specific behavior that separates us from every other species more clearly than tools or language ever could: imitation. Many animals can imitate to some degree. Birds copy songs, primates copy actions, even octopuses can learn by observation. But humans imitate in a completely different way. We imitate too well. Imagine a simple experiment. A person is shown how to open a box to get a reward. During the demonstration, the instructor performs several clearly unnecessary actions: tapping the box, touching irrelevant parts, making extra movements that have no effect on the outcome. Then the participant tries again and again across cultures and age groups. The same thing happens. People repeat every step, including the useless ones. Even when they understand those steps don't matter, even when they are explicitly told they can skip them. Animals don't do this. They quickly eliminate what's unnecessary and go straight for the result. Humans don't. We copy ritually. This phenomenon is known as overimitation. At first glance, it looks inefficient, even stupid, but it turns out to be one of the most powerful evolutionary traits ever to appear. Because overimitation doesn't just copy actions, it copies patterns, sequences, rules, symbols, meanings. A brain wired to replicate complex behavior without filtering is a perfect environment for something else to spread: ideas. If a system can copy information with high fidelity, variation is inevitable. And once variation exists, competition begins. Some ideas spread better than others. Some are easier to remember. Some trigger emotion. Some demand repetition. They copy themselves from mind to mind. They mutate, they compete, they survive or disappear. At that point, the same cold algorithm that once shaped molecules and genes switches on again. Only now the replicator is no longer biological, it's cultural. This is the moment where most people feel resistance, because it sounds abstract, but it isn't. Words replicate, melodies replicate, gestures replicate, stories replicate, beliefs replicate. And just like genes, they don't replicate because they are true or useful, they replicate because they are good at replicating. Once you accept that, a disturbing possibility appears. At some point in human history, a second replicator emerged, not made of DNA, made of information. And the human brain became its habitat, the same way oceans once became the habitat for early life. If that's true, then a lot of things suddenly make sense. Why evolution tolerated an absurdly expensive brain, why humans often act against their biological self-interest, why we sacrifice time, energy, even survival itself for ideas, symbols, and narratives. But if this second replicator truly exists, it must behave the same way all replicators do. It must be selfish, it must protect itself, and it must push its host to spread it, whether that benefits them or not. And that's where things stop being theoretical, because the most aggressive form of this replication is something every human knows intimately. Sound is the most aggressive carrier this second replicator has ever found. It doesn't require eye contact, it works in the dark, it spreads in all directions at once, and it can infect many minds simultaneously. That's why melodies stick, why certain rhythms refuse to leave your head, why a phrase can replay itself for days, even when you don't like it. You don't choose to hum a tune, you are being used to reproduce it. Once sound became available, this new replicator gained an enormous advantage. Under its pressure, The crude noises of our ancestors slowly transformed into precise, structured speech. Not because speech was strictly necessary for survival, but because it was incredibly efficient for copying. Language became the perfect transmission system. That's why humans talk so much, and often about nothing important at all. Nearly half of our waking life is spent in passive thinking, internal monologue, mental repetition, chains of associations that serve no obvious purpose. From a genetic perspective, this is a waste of energy. From the perspective of cultural replicators, it's a dream environment. Thoughts arise on their own. You don't decide what your next thought will be. Try it right now. Ask yourself, what will I think about next? There's a pause, then a thought appears. You didn't create it, you waited for it. That pause reveals something uncomfortable. The human mind is not fully under conscious control. It behaves like a crowded ecosystem, a space where ideas compete for attention, and the most successful ones are not the most accurate or helpful, but the most contagious. This explains why certain brands inspire loyalty far beyond reason, why people defend slogans, symbols, and narratives as if they were part of their identity, why jokes, trends, and catchphrases spread faster than useful information. They are not spreading because they are good for you, they are spreading because they are good at spreading. The same applies to music, humor, dance, movies, and stories. We devote enormous amounts of time and energy to consuming repeating patterns that offer no calories, no shelter, and no direct survival benefit, yet we crave them. Because the brain didn't evolve only under genetic pressure, it evolved under cultural pressure as well. At some point, these two forces locked together. Genes favored brains that could imitate well. Memes favored brains that could host and transmit them efficiently. A feedback loop emerged. Better imitators spread more ideas. More ideas demanded larger, more flexible brains. Larger brains enabled even more complex ideas. And eventually, imitation stopped being a tool. It became the goal. Reproductive success began to depend not on strength or endurance, but on visibility, charisma, creativity, and attention, on being a better carrier of ideas. This is why art, humor, music, and performance hold such strange power over us, not because they help us survive, but because they accelerate replication. And like all replicators, ideas do not need to be kind. In mild forms, they appear as intrusive thoughts or irresistible urges to share something. In extreme cases, they take over. Voices, commands, compulsions. It is no coincidence that auditory hallucinations are the most common and the most convincing. Sound is the strongest vector. When the brain loses its ability to integrate competing ideas into a single coherent self, those ideas begin to behave like independent agents, arguing, demanding, threatening. This is a tragic and rare case where we see cultural replicators in their raw, uncontrolled form, but even in healthy minds, the mechanism is still there. If we strip away comforting illusions, what is a human being? Not just an animal, but not a pure autonomous self either. We are a hybrid. Genes built the body, memes built the mind. Without genes, there would be no brain. Without memes, there would be no person. Isolate a child from culture and the human mind never fully emerges. No language, no abstraction, no stable sense of self. Consciousness does not exist above ideas. It emerges from their interaction. We defend our beliefs not because they are true, but because they are part of us, like a limb. That's why the idea of freeing a person from all memes makes no sense. there would be nothing left to free. This is how a new form of life appeared, not purely biological, not purely cultural, a hybrid born from the interaction of two replicators, one billions of years old, the other far younger, faster, and far less predictable. And perhaps the most unsettling implication is this: the most dangerous part of Darwin's idea is not that we descended from apes, it's that evolution never stopped. It simply changed its medium. I'd really appreciate any support. Leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the like button. It helps the channel more than you think.